Kusa everybody. I'd like to acknowledge the central monastic body, the Centre for Bhutan and GNH Studies, and particularly Dr. Ora, and also the royal family who've been deeply supportive of all of this. It's a wonderful occasion, and I'm very glad to be here. Okay, as Dr. Ora mentioned when introducing me on Monday when I chaired the initial panel of the academic panel of this conference, one of the topics in Buddhist health practices that I've been working on for many years is longevity practice, or CB&GNHS, and he mentioned the well-known CB&GNHS tradition, which was revealed in Bhutan in 1904, the CB&GNHS Sogtik, which is a practice of the deity CB&GNHS, corresponding more or less to the Indian deity Amitayas. Today's paper isn't primarily about the CB&GNHS Sogtik, but about a much earlier CB&GNHS practice associated with a famous Indian woman teacher who is known in Tibetan as Rtsa, the Queen of the Siddhas. We don't really know what she was called in her local language, but most of the Western scholars who discuss her use the name Did Rtsa. So we don't know much about Did Rtsa, but there's a well-known story which many of you may be familiar with in one version or another, which is about Jetsun Milarepa's student, Rtsa. And Rtsa received a longevity practice from Did Rtsa on his last visit to India. In the story, Rtsa is about to set off back to Tibet when his local guru, Tilbupa, sends him off to a show or entertainment of some kind in a local town. Maybe some sort of display of yogic power, I don't know. But anyway, there's this rather mysterious yogin there who looks at Rtsa and says, "You have good potential for the Dharma, but you're going to die in 7 months' time." Rtsa is understandably somewhat concerned about this. So he goes back to his guru Tilbupa, who it seems also knows that Rtsa is going to die in 7 months' time. But he says, "It's all right. There is this woman who has realized CB&GNHS. Go see her, she'll help you." And so he goes off to Did Rtsa. He does 7 months intensive practice under Did Rtsa's direction. And she then tells him that he will now live for another 44 years. So he goes off back to Tibet, where Milarepa is very impressed to hear about all this and says, "This is a really profound practice. We don't have anything like this in Tibet." And he asks Rtsa to give him the practice, which it does, and it's passed down through the Kagyu tradition. In fact, it seems a bit uncertain that Rtsa ever met Did Rtsa, but Did Rtsa seems to have been a real enough person anyway. There are several texts by her in the Tengyo, including texts for this practice that I'm talking about here. So, this is a multiply rewritten paper, so finding my way around it may be a little bit challenging at times. But at any rate, none of the people who are in the lineage by which this practice is supposed to have been passed down through the Kagyu seem to have written about it until the 14th century, when Jebarawa Gyaltsen Pelsangpo, who's the founder of a Kagyu suborder called the Barawa Kagyu, wrote a text on it, or a series of short texts on it. And that was then picked up by other people. The Gedundrup, the first Dalai Lama, as he later became known, wrote a commentary on this practice, which is largely based on Barawa, and he got it from several lines from Barawa. And it became quite important among the Gelugpa. In the Drukpa Kagyu, Drukchen Pemakapo wrote extensively on the Did Rtsa practices, and this became quite an important practice. I first learnt about it through a survey of CB&GNHS practices by a sort of minor Rime Lama called Solcho Lama, it's the first practice he discusses in his massive 4-volume collection. And part of the reason for this is that this is a supreme yoga practice, and it's the only one that appears to have come from India to Tibet. And this got me rather interested. Why should a longevity practice be a supreme yoga practice? Now, in formal terms, it's fairly easy to see why, because this practice has several sections which are essentially kirim, development stage, and then at the end it has a short section which is in effect a dzogrim, though it's not called that. Later generations of scholars like Vajrayāna and so on did refer to it as dzogrim. It's a Rtsa rlung practice. And it's a Rtsa rlung practice which is actually, it's quite similar to Tummo. It involves visualization of channels, flows and drops and the usual things. And it concludes the practice as a whole. But while that explains perhaps why this is classified as a supreme yoga practice, it doesn't really explain why the Rtsa rlung is there and why a longevity practice should take this form. Because supreme yoga practice, or Anuttara yoga practice as it used to be called by a lot of Western scholars, isn't generally about this worldly benefits like long life. It's about achieving Buddhahood. And so why did Siddharajani's practice include the Rtsa rlung? So I should say a little bit more about Supreme Yoga Tantra. My apologies, because there are many people in this room who know much more about it than I do, and are much more experienced with it. But just to say something that's come up in various ways in several papers already anyway, which is that one of its primary features is it's divided into these two stages, the kirim, creation, visualization, generation or development stage, the various ways it's translated, and the dzogrim, fulfillment or completion stage. Now, the kirim consists of very much the same sorts of practices that were already existing in Yoga Tantra, assuming that this comes after Yoga Tantra, which historically it seems to. Supreme Yoga Tantra practices got going in about 800 or so, as we can tell, in India, mainly in the context of the Guhya Samaja Tantra. So, kirim consists of the visualization of deities, or creative visualization, imagination of deity in a mandala, the creative identification of the meditator with the central deities, normally, the reciting of praise to the deity, of mantras, connection with the deity, and the calling down of blessings from the deity. There are various ways in which these processes can be understood philosophically, and we had a bit of the complications here in Jacob Dalton's paper this morning. But in general, the deities who are visualized in kirim are not thought of as illusory, although they're created by visualization. They allow the practitioner to make contact with real powers from whose spiritual benefit can genuinely be obtained. However, they exist essentially at the level of conventional reality. And here we get the sort of question which Jacob was talking about earlier, of different levels within conventional reality. This is certainly as good as conventional reality gets, if you like. But dzogrim practices, fulfillment or perfection stage practices, are aimed at the direct experience of ultimate reality, of seeing things as they really are, the state which is known in Sanskrit as Mahamudra or Chagchen in Tibetan. And in fact, phrases like things as they are, just as they are, dishingi, dikunani, translating tattva in Sanskrit, are very characteristic of early writings on dzogrim and Mahamudra. And Siddharajani's dzogrim section is actually called Dikuna Nidrup, the practice for attaining reality, not dzogrim, though, as I said, later on it came to be called dzogrim. As I said, it's very similar to Tummo, and here it's worth moving to some neuroscientific work which I've been associated with by the neuroscientist Maria Kozhevnikov, in which he looks at the sequence of deity yoga, such as you get in the generation stage, the Kirim, Tummo, and the non-conceptual practices such as Mahamudra, and argues that you can understand neurologically why these form a sequence and how the deity practice and the Tummo kind of focus and energize the body, the mind-body, in preparation for the Mahamudra, the direct insight into reality. I think this is a very interesting model. It's basically a fairly simple model, but it is interesting that she seems to have come up with these results. I've written a bit about this actually in an article with Maria in the recent Oxford Handbook for Tantric Studies, if anyone's interested in that. But what has all this got to do with longevity? One way to approach this question might be to say, what do we really mean by longevity anyway? And the Tibetan texts themselves, they use a variety of different words. And Tsedrup is probably the most common, and that's really an abbreviation for Tsedrupa or Jimedrupa, achieving the power of the city of long life or the city of immortality. And people also talk about Tsering. The first Dalai Lama uses that term mostly. And another term is Chilu, meaning something like deluding death or evading death. Now, extending life is fairly straightforward, but conceptually and even in Western terms. You could imagine that somebody who, like Rtsa in the story, is 40 years old, might die within a few months, particularly in India in those days. He equally might live for another 44 years. You could also imagine that a suitable set of yogic practices might stimulate or fine-tune the immune system and the body's own defenses against potentially fatal illness, and so help to bring about this longer life. But deceiving death or achieving the city of immortality is something else again. What do these mean? There are a few Tibetans, of course, such as the famous yogic practitioner, bridge builder, theatrical innovator, Tangtong Gyalpo, who are held to have lived for well over a century. But I think Tibetans and Bhutanese are well aware that in the conventional reality within which we mostly live, sooner or later, everyone dies. This, however, is within conventional reality, in which we are separate individuals with distinct and separate selves. Arguably, death might look quite different from the point of view of ultimate reality. This seems to be what, for example, the 10th to 11th century Indian Buddhist scholar Vajrayāna Kirti, Ngawang Drapa, as he's known in Turkey, argues in his well-known verse treatise on how to evade or deceive death, which is one of the texts that's quoted a lot in Tibetan writings in this area. The fourth and last chapter of his treatise discusses Vajrayāna techniques for avoiding death, and it includes a section on Dzogchen practices. This begins with Rtsa rlung and moves on to Mahamudra, the state or condition in which conventional reality is transcended and the true nature of reality is revealed. And Vajrayāna Kirti comments that at this level, the yogic practitioner no longer perceives death, which only arises because of false conceptions, vikalpa in Sanskrit, nor does he perceive the many other mara, nor samsara. So what this seems to be saying is that a way to avoid death is to move onto a plane on which death doesn't really exist or doesn't make any sense. And this is something that you can hear from contemporary lamas too. Changling Rinpoche told me something very much like this when I first started working on this practice, that the real city of immortality is the realization of the illusory nature of our ordinary perceptions of space and time, and which of course is part of the attainment of Buddhahood as we conventionally understand it. If time is illusory, the duration of life is also without meaning. So, here perhaps we find the answer to the question of why Siddharajni ended her text, unlike all the earlier texts that we know of on longevity practice, with a Dzogchen section. It points towards a deeper and more fundamental transformation of consciousness than that in the earlier parts, leading to a level in which reality is seen directly, and death as such no longer has any meaning. And perhaps it was this that gave the practice its popularity. Certainly it was picked up by many later long life practices, both in the Samapa and in the Nyingmapa tradition, including the Chime Soptic, which has quite a lot of Rtsa rlung in it. Now, the Buddhist tradition has, of course, all along aimed at a radical transformation of our experience of reality. Mahayana Buddhism combines this transformation with the uncovering within ourselves of the compassionate motivation of bodhicitta. So in some respects, Siddharajani's practice is taking us back to the core of the Buddhist tradition. It's pointing out that if you're all right, you can go ahead and go for practices which will extend your life, and there may be good dharmic reasons for doing this, but in reality, the tradition is aimed at something beyond this. But in closing, what I'd rather more want to point out is that I see this question of a radical transformation of consciousness as a central issue, particularly of our time. And I want to end with a few brief comments on that. We're living in a world in which the emotional manipulations of social media, the self-interested lies of populist politics, and the reality-transforming symbioses of human and artificial intelligence are becoming very much the environment within which we're living. And they're making it increasingly difficult for anyone to know what's really going on around us. At least that's my feeling. I'm getting very confused about what's going on. This is not so much a question of factual knowledge and logical reasoning. And it's all right, I'll finish in the next 2 minutes. Though Kashevnikov's neuroscientific work suggests that the energizing and focusing effect of Vajrayāna practice may help with factual knowledge and logical reasoning, I think the question that's important here is more one of a reshaping of human consciousness to deal with the new realities that we're being called on to inhabit, of finding a way to keep our balance within this increasingly scary and potentially dangerous new world, which is going to demand very different things of us. Above all, perhaps, is to recognize the commonality of all life, human and non-human, and the possibility of accessing the compassion and mutual care that the Vajrayāna tradition sees as the inner nature of the universe, as the Dharmakaya, the Buddha nature. So if this is what Siddharajani's practice is pointing us towards, and I think in some ways it is, then finally perhaps we are entering an age in which it and its successors are going to be more relevant than they ever have. That's all, thanks.